Hello, everyone. Big thanks for coming to PostCon. Also, a big thank you for coming to this panel specifically. I know we have two others going on at the same time. I want you to know that you picked the right one. This is the best one. No offense to my colleagues or their panelists. I'm sure they're great people, but this is the better room. So my name is Noah Schwartz. I look after the Postman Public API Network. I'll be your moderator for this panel. Just to give you a quick idea of what the network is, I think it's pretty straightforward. As you've been hearing throughout the day, hopefully many of you already know, Postman's got millions of users who are using Postman all the time to do collaboration with APIs. And the way they do that is with collections and workspaces. And so what the public API network is, it's a way for individuals and companies, tens of thousands of them, to actually connect with and collaborate with those developers, those have that reach. We call those folks publishers. And the idea is that they get a chance to grow their community and then help that community learn their APIs in minutes without having to write a single line of code. And the reason why this matters is because developers have options when they're choosing an API to solve a problem. There's obvious considerations as they make those options. There's costs, there's use cases, there's SLAs, things like that. But developers also want to see something working really fast. And the experience of using the API, the size of the community, the participation of the community, reference material, what happens when something goes wrong, these are all considerations a developer makes before they commit to an API. And collectively, we call that developer experience. So if you want to be successful with any product, forget APIs, you have to have a great customer experience. In my personal opinion, when it comes to developers, they're some of the most demanding and needy customers out there, which makes sense. Oftentimes, they're using a product that they feel they themselves could develop and do a better job of building, and they're not afraid to tell you that. So their expectations are constantly increasing, and maybe you were doing something a couple of years ago, and it was good back then, but today it's not good enough. So you have to keep up with their expectations, which means that the priority of a good developer experience is always increasing. That's what today's session is all about. Developer experience is a priority for API products. And we're lucky to be joined by some very amazing people who were kind enough to come out here and join us to help us explore this topic. So I'm going to start all the way at the end here. We have John Agon. He's got over, clap. Thank you. He's got over 25 years of experience building products and developer platforms. Some of them, many of them I'm sure are well known and loved by folks in this room, including GitHub, Slack, Twitch, and Webflow. He's also an advisor for startups looking to get into developer products. And today he's the VP of Product and Data at Replit. And my favorite thing about John Agon is that in addition to being a Dragon Lord, he's also been using, a little bit of a delay there, okay. He's also been using Postman for 10 years since it was launched as a Chrome extension. That's near and dear to my heart. That was my first introduction to Postman also, was the Chrome extension. To his right, we have Bear Douglas. Bear's built and led developer relations and advocacy teams at Facebook, Twitter, Slack, and now Pinecone. Just want to give a personal thank you to Bear. I've coded against many of those APIs. I'm sure other folks in the room have as well. And You've created some great developer experiences, so thank you for that. While preparing for this panel, I watched a bunch of videos about these folks and heard them talk before, and Bear said something I really liked. I actually think it was at Postman Galaxy, which predated PostCon. Anyway, she said that one of the best opportunities to have a great developer experience is when something goes wrong with the API. So how do you treat your customer when something goes wrong? And that's actually the meaning behind the title of the session, Exceptional Handling. Software throws exceptions, and you want to handle them exceptionally well. And maybe we'll be able to talk more about that later. Bear also told me that she's started a cappella groups at Facebook and Twitter with clever names like the Vocal Network and the Songbirds. But apparently at Pinecone, they don't think that's cool. But a cappella covers are my favorite, so I maybe can hear some on YouTube. I didn't see any of those. And then finally, certainly not least, we have Philippe Ozil. He's a principal developer advocate at Salesforce. So we have a few things to congratulate him on today. The first one is that it's his 8-year anniversary at Salesforce. So we can start with that. And that's a big achievement, but I think the bigger one is Salesforce won the best overall API award today from Postman. We have 100,000 APIs on the network. And when I say APIs, I don't mean like endpoints, I mean unique base URL. So that's a pretty wild achievement to win best overall. Philippe's a huge part of the reason why Salesforce has reached the scale and success it's having on Postman. And if we don't get to talk about it today, I highly encourage you to ask him about the origin story of Salesforce's public workspace, because it's pretty wild. So once again, congratulations. Okay, so we have amazing folks here, a wealth of experience. Let's get into it. Let's start, Bear, with you. So you have a lot of experience building great developer experiences across the roles that you've been in. And I think maybe just for the room to get a baseline here, like what is the priority of developer experience today? What's the bar we're starting with?
Yeah, I mean, it's everything you said in your intro. The stakes here are pretty clear. It's how robust your community is, whether or not people are going to be able to approach your API's front door, which might be documentation, looking at any sort of public resources you have in terms of community forums, and making a decision from there. So when we think about the baseline bar, what you're seeing from many companies today is some amount of live support in the form of Discords or Slack workspaces, and some expectation that you're going to be responsive on Twitter. So that level of communication and personality being brought to the table on the community side. There's definitely a higher expectation on documentation than I think there has been in the past, because there have been more and more companies that do a great job of raising the bar about what docs can look like, the level of interactivity you can expect, and what you should be able to walk away from just using somebody's docs. So all of that has been bolstered too with improvements in tooling from GitHub and from others like README has vastly improved their offerings, and there are new documentation providers. At Pinecone, we use one called Midlify that has just made it much easier to create these really positive and polished experiences of your documentation site when you come in. So all of those are things that I think have set the bar and raised the bar over time. Is that first glance impression makes a huge difference.
Cool. I don't know if any follow-ups on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Documentation is kind of everything. I mean, if it's too hard to get started, or you can't find the docs, you'll know where to go, then you might just pass and go to the one that does. I mean, there's so much good DevX out there that I think docs are key.
Yeah, technical writers are not getting the respect they deserve.
I definitely agree with that. I was actually going to ask you, Philippe, how have you, 8 years at Salesforce, I mean, I may be ashamed to say this out loud. I mean, I don't know if Salesforce was necessarily so API driven 8 years ago. Maybe it was, but like, how has the priority changed over the 8 years that you've been there?
So we didn't exactly discover API. We kind of invented web APIs. In fact, we were part of the first few companies providing APIs on the web back in 2000 or so. So no, I saw things change because we've added a number of constraints for quality of service, I would say, explorability, automation around API discovery. So these are the key things we really have been invested in, like schemas, things like that. Yeah.
I remember seeing something. I think it was called REST Explorer.
REST Explorer,
yeah. And it was.
We kind of invented a mini Postman before Postman was created. Yes, our community did that. Yeah.
Don't let Abhinav hear that. Yeah. Well, let me actually start with you, Philippe, while you're talking. Do you think that companies are doing enough right now? I mean, we're talking about documentation and meeting folks where they are in their community. Like, is that enough?
Oh, there's always room for improvement, I would say. People no longer expect like, static documentation. They want to get started very fast. And I think the key success factor is really the time to first successful API call. And we saw that in a number of talks before. The critical barrier generally is authentication, because you want to run just an API call, but first you have to authenticate. And figuring out how you can authenticate is always the key limiting factor in discovery of APIs. So providing easy mechanisms to get started, that's really what helps.
Maybe just to follow up on that, actually, you say you said time to first call, or sometimes people talk about time to first 200 OK. How do you measure that? Like, how do you not like you don't have to get like so super detailed and technical about it, just like high level, because there's so many like beginnings and ends there.
Absolutely. So there are a number of things you can do. First, you can look at your error rates on the monitoring side of things, and I think Postman does a really good job of providing us metrics with the publisher metrics on the API network. That's one way to measure that. And then, of course, on your servers, you probably have the telemetry to do that. And you can just watch your different support channels. That's generally a good sign. I mean, if you don't see anybody complaining about authentication and struggling, that's pretty much good.
Cool. Well, I mean, coming back to you, Bear, I mean, do you think, you told us the baseline, do you think that's enough?
I mean, there's, like you said, there's always room for improvement. And jumping off your point about authentication being one of the biggest barriers, I think one of the smartest things that Slack did relatively early on was recognize that a lot of people were building just for their own workspace. And so if you could just put them through an OAuth flow right away and hand them the token and just say, build with this token, you don't even need to think about authenticating users in the context of a single company, then they were off to the races right away with a simple UI flow. And then they had the token that they didn't even need to think about implementing auth. And that just lowered the time to hello world so significantly. And we just sort of pushed off having to think about auth until a much later time if you wanted to do something that would actually go on the app directory. So is that doing enough? I think it's a smart choice. What enough is really dependent on the context of when you see people dropping off. But I think there are important trade-offs to think about with where you're spending your product and engineering calories.
Yeah. Same question for me?
No, I mean, up to you. I mean, I saw a smirk there.
I'll throw a wild card at you. I think virality is a big part of it. So giving developers a way to show off their work, give them a way to share it, letting other people fork it, remix it, whatever. I think that's a big part of it too. Sometimes you get so invested in the code that you're writing or something that you're learning, and you just want to show it off. I mean, look how successful GitHub's been from that. I feel like a lot of platforms do a lot to highlight the work and really like cool things developers are doing on their platform.
Yeah, Philippe was telling me earlier that the folks who are forking the Salesforce collection on Postman are actually they're submitting you back pull requests, and then they see room for improvement.
Yeah, it's been our strategy really, the fact that people can contribute even outside of the scope of your company, they can share, and yeah, getting started with examples is definitely the best way to get started.
Cool, so that's an interesting take. So maybe, I think John, maybe the point, or saying it in different words is, one of the ways to have a great DX is to give the DX into the hands of the developers.
Yeah.
Let them improve it directly, or at least make strong suggestions on how to improve it.
That's right.
Yeah, turn your customers into advocates.
Yep, makes sense. And then, John, talking to you, how do you stand out from the crowd?
How do you stand out from the crowd?
Yeah.
You've got to, I think virality is a big part of it, but
Yeah.
being able to show it off. But I think docs are a big part of it. I think the quality of the APIs and the types of APIs you build are a big part of it. We tend to build a lot of APIs that just replicate tables, and then you just tie these things together and hope someone does something with it. So I think if you put a little bit of thought and love into the APIs you build, I think that actually is represented in developer experience as well. Being very thoughtful about the parameter types, the protocols, all of those pieces as well.
Okay. Maybe oversimplifying, but I think like the takeaways from me from this question: strong documentation, strong first experience. You gave an interesting example there with Slack, actually, which I noticed the other week. I was doing something with Slack, and it didn't even occur to me that I didn't have to think too hard about how to get a token. So I think that's really insightful. Community involvement, and that makes a ton of sense. I think did I miss anything there?
I would have DevRel support. If you have a DevRel team,
yeah, right.
really
Absolutely,
help
they are, that's
go
right.
viral. That's what we did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool, makes sense. So John, I'll actually throw this next question to you. I'm actually really excited about your take on this one. You've worked more on developer platforms, and I know the things you've worked on also have APIs, but they're more platformy than they are APIs. But people use those platforms to build and call APIs all the time.
Yep.
So let's talk about like the prioritization of developer experience as APIs are increasingly like they are the product. How is that changing things?
I mean, you put a P0 on it when you're working on it. That's the biggest change. We used to, it wasn't that long ago that developer experience was just a nice little touch on a launch, right? And now, I mean, developers know what good experience is. There's so many options. They're going to go to the one that has great developer experience. So I see developer experience as make or break when you're launching these days. Another thing that I think, speaking to the product side of it, is really how you're crafting the APIs. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of older style APIs which are just kind of representation of data. Companies are being a little bit more sensitive about letting go of that data. So, you're seeing a trend more towards like the jobs to be done as APIs. We heard of the keynote about like a big part of planning APIs is planning. And if you could take some of that planning off, that gets them to success quicker. So I think getting them the APIs of jobs to be done is a big part of the product piece of it, and then wrapping that in awesome developer experience. gives you the ability to really measure it and really see like how people are using it and extracting value. And then ultimately you be able to monetize it if you're fortunate.
So if you're API first, maybe you also need to be DX first.
Yeah, for sure.
You heard that here for the first time, everyone. So Bear, actually, this is also an interesting question for you because you've worked at so many companies, and Pinecone in particular, and maybe oversimplifying, where like, in some sense, the API is the product. So I'm kind of wondering how you've seen the differences you've seen at companies where the API is the product versus companies where the API is maybe not the product, is maybe more of an extension of the product.
Yeah, there's definitely it's much easier to justify the resourcing that you want for delivering a great developer experience, and we can break down what we mean by that a little bit. Like, if you are trying to write documentation for a fast-moving product, are you going to be able to argue for 5 tech writers headcount? Or are you going to be told, you can probably do an okay enough job with one person who's sweating bullets every weekend because they're trying to push and keep up with engineering teams? It's trade-offs like, how well staffed is your support team? Are they being held to SLAs that they can keep up with reasonably, or is there some misunderstanding about the average level of complexity of any developer ticket, and are they being compared to general support tickets that might be about pricing, and how do you have to fight to help people understand the amount of time it takes people, and how you should think about both, yes, hiring people, paying people, spending the time, and also thinking about what's a P0 on your product release. There's so many individual elements that we're talking about broadly as developer experience, and whenever it costs money, it is definitely helpful when the API is your product to say, this is something that we should invest in because the revenue tracking end to end is there. And if something else is a sort of loss leader or a bet, and the API is maybe an extension or something that they're trying out as an experiment, it is harder to argue for that kind of resourcing.
Interesting. So Philippe, Salesforce, large company, obviously. How do you advocate for resourcing and support internally? Kind of going off of what Bear was just saying.
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is that you have to measure things not just as costs. Like, for example, documentation is not really tied to a cost, but support is tied to a cost. And it can be like a wrong way to calculate things, saying you should deflect cases, basically, like invest in documentation, invest in examples, because it will reduce the number of cases and then get you a better outcome. I think that's a way to advocate for resources in this space. It will serve the general product quality, and it will help users get started fast, unload support from just basic errors, like getting started errors. That's something I think helps.
Maybe connecting some dots here to the previous question. I think in some sense you're a little bit of a one-person army when it comes to developer advocacy and DevRel at Salesforce. I'm sure that's not entirely true, but and so one of the ways you've managed to scale yourself then is by having the community be able to contribute back. So you don't always have to ask. Sometimes the community can do it for you.
Absolutely. So yeah, I'm a big fan of open source. So the way I've spun up our collections is with an open source model. But even before the public API workspace started, I thought, okay, we don't have any specific resource, but we're going to try something. We're going to try with a small collection and let people contribute. So after some time and a bit of different media to support it, blog, videos, we got some interest, and it snowballed into this big set of collections now with multiple users from different products contributing and enriching the experience. So it's not just something the company builds, it's also something the community takes an active part in. And that's a general tendency I saw in the software industry. People are turning their documentation, for example, as open source. You saw a number of documentation that are now being on GitHub or other platforms, which helps user provide examples or fix typos, comments, that's the kind of thing. And that's really what worked for us.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If it's okay to jump in
please.
with something, I do think that it can be an unfortunate tendency in companies that aren't truly invested in open source to say, if we open source it, they will come. And that there is this amount of maintenance that really should be done by your core team that maybe you can convince people in the community to do. And I think that developers can generally smell when that is the attitude of the company versus a real investment in open source, which is a much more labor-intensive thing to support in the way that you're talking about.
Totally agree.
Just a question for the three of you, and you could just kind of jump in any order. Something John was saying, we're talking about a few moments ago. We're talking a lot about developer experience and how to do a good job and how it's changing and evolving over time. Well, one of the things I was said a few times now on stage is that you lose customers if you don't have a good developer experience. Like, is that something that we think is true, or is that something we know is true?
I would say that depends on whether your product is a developer-first product or not.
Yeah.
In the case of Salesforce, I'll be honest, we're not a developer-first product, so of course we need to have a good DX, but it is not like the top priority for us.
Yeah. Because I guess in some sense, developers, like the API has already been chosen, so someone's using Salesforce, and so there the DX matters because you want to get them onboarded quickly.
Of course.
New employees at a company.
You still care about productivity, of course, but they're not the buyers. So.
Yeah.
I can speak to it firsthand that seeing good and bad, it's very hard to convince developers to adopt and invest time and resources in a platform that doesn't have great DX. So to say you lose them, I guess maybe the wording is maybe not losing, is just it's hard to get them to adopt it and really buy into it. I mean, it's a big ask that you're asking them to build on your platform. So, if you're not able to deliver on some of the expectations, then you're never going to win them over. So that was been in my experience, at least.
Do you think it conveys trust when there is an exceptional DX? Or someone, or maybe not even exceptional, but like someone that clearly cares?
Yes,
Boy.
absolutely. You know what? One other area on trust is change management is a good part of DX. And if you're breaking changes and you're not thinking about the developers downstream or their customers, that completely breaks trust. So that's another part of it.
Bear, I wanted to, before I go there, you mentioned revenue a minute ago, John. Is revenue a factor? I'll kind of ask that to the group here, and how does that change? I mean, obviously the answer is yes, but how does that factor in? Bear, maybe looking at you more, thinking more about Pinecone recently.
Thinking about Pinecone recently. I mean, Pinecone, because the API is the product, as you said before, the stream is clear between providing somebody a great developer experience and eventually that being realized into revenue. That hasn't been true at every company I've been at. And like I alluded to before, in times when you're making a bet on an API or a platform piece being a loss leader, then there is definitely a tension in when will the piper come calling about the things that you have to ship or the ways that you might need to change the experiences that you are giving developers to sort of nudge them toward revenue. And that can sometimes end up being a negative DX, because if the hypothesis that you had about how you were going to onboard people through either a great free tier or something appealing about the product that could eventually lead to revenue, if that doesn't pan out, I have seen it happen many times before that people end up with a product that diverges from what they initially were using it for, and the developer experience of kind of riding the wave of these major product changes is fairly negative. So you lose people along the way, even as you're trying to pivot to something that gets you to being revenue positive. Yeah. And hopefully I have made that clear without speaking in too concrete details, so you don't know who I'm talking about, but you understand my point.
Sorry about the pushiness of the question, Well, I'll just tell you the reason why I asked.
Yeah.
Because my previous role, one of them at AWS, sometimes we charge per API call, right? And that's a good developer experience might be having fewer API calls, right? Because the more you have to call an API to get to some outcome, if you want to do something in batch. And so we always kind of had this approach of, okay, it may result in less revenue, but it's better for the developer, and so we're just going to that's okay. And maybe even in some cases we thought about our pricing incorrectly, and so it was it's really what I was poking at, is keeping the two decoupled, which I think is what you're saying. Not
necessarily. I mean, what you're saying is that packaging is as much part of the developer experience as anything else. Like, unpacking what we mean by DX is important here, because I'm sure as any of us who have worked at startups before know, as you're trying to figure out how exactly you're going to get your customers to pay you and on what cadence and for what, the packaging does matter as part of the development experience. If people have to think about things like, what will this POC cost me as I'm building it, that can be a deciding factor in whether or not they even begin. And so whether it's thinking about making your free tier robust or thinking about what the good on-ramp is from somebody who's kicking the tires into being a real customer, that of course is part of developer experience.
I think it's super insightful.
I got one to jump in.
Yeah.
I think it also goes back to like, what is your product? Is it the API or something else? If it's the API, then definitely revenue is a big part of it. If it's not, I think it's customer retention. That's the big piece that you would measure, because if you have a core product and your customers want some integration, then you need developers to help build that integration. And if you don't have that integration, you might lose customers for it if it's a critical one. So I think that's the other side of it. It's revenue, but it's indirect revenue, I guess.
Yeah. Bear, I think what you said is so insightful, because we started off talking about developer experience as a priority, talking about documentation and meeting your customers where they are. And I'm not saying any of those things are obvious. They're obviously they're important. But I think what you said about packaging, thinking about it from a product perspective, like developer experience starts way before there's someone wearing a hat, that has the term DevRel or Dev Advocacy on it. It starts much earlier than that. Yep. Possibly even when the thing itself is just being not possibly, obviously when the thing itself is even just being designed. And I think maybe sometimes collectively folks lose sight of that, and they try to have a good DX after. But to the earlier point, API first, DX first. Yeah. Philippe, I think it's fair to say that you're one of the most qualified people to answer this next question. Let's talk about given the award you won, and so let's talk about what are the success modes for developer experience?
So it's been a long journey, but I think really what I already shared earlier is that getting users involved and not only counting on documentation, which is a good solid foundation, is going beyond and shortening the path from discovering the API to running this first successful API call, and providing the right examples, making sure it goes viral, to go back to your point. That's something I think that really helps. We struggled a bit at first without the public API network because we had to reinvent the wheel to distribute our own APIs. It turns out now that there's the proper tooling to do it and to measure it, because that was also one of our kind of not a roadblock, but something we struggled to measure the outcome of what we were producing, figuring out whether people were adopting our APIs based on the examples we were sharing. We weren't exactly sure about how well it was successful, but now we have the metrics to back it, so it's really helpful, I think.
What are some of the metrics you look at?
So the number of metrics we use are the typical ones that you can find if you have a public API workspace. These are the forks. You can also take a look at the views, the watchers, and this gives you a trend, and you can measure over time whether this gains traction. Also, whenever you connect your resources with any kind of enablement content, whether it's a video or live stream or a blog post, this also helps. And you can measure how the two are interrelated. Whenever also you release a new API, this kind of thing has an impact on your traffic, and that's what we measure, really.
Just kind of keeping it with you for a minute, and then I do want to move it around. You made this statement like 6 years ago or something. I think it was, you said, when it comes to developer experience, you said start small and dream big. So if you're starting small and you want to be successful, what's a good way to start in your opinion?
So yeah, we really started from nothing, and now we're at 200,006 fork or something. It's like an incredible number. And the reason why we got there is that we were incremental in our approach. We didn't try to cover everything at first. We started with a very small collection, and then we gradually added some more resources, added new products. The idea is really to find a good base that you can expand and build upon, and then you iterate, really. We started with just one product. Nowadays, there are like 6 products, 11 collections on the Salesforce workspace. So that's quite an achievement. And I think we drew a lot of success on just this first collection, and then other teams want to join in. And I think now we have something that we can replicate, and a trust model, really, that works well.
And that can be intimidating to do, right? Because if you're trying to hold yourself to this bar of developer experience excellence, but also subscribe to the maximum. I forget who said it, but if you're not embarrassed by your first release, you waited too long to put the product out, and it's kind of the same thing. Like, it can be scary if you're saying our bar for quality of developer experience is here, but also here's the small thing that we're starting with, and so you have to have some pragmatic balance between realistically how long is it going to take to get to here, and how many people can we be helping in the interim if we start here and keep on building on it. So that's difficult to to square. So well done on you guys.
I agree. We cannot think about governance first when we build the first one.
Right.
Only later on can we think about governance, versioning, all of these things, release notes. It's start small, deliver something that brings value, and then figure out whether it's the right thing, or maybe you're making a mistake and invest in something else. So.
Yeah. And if you make a mistake, it was a relatively small investment. So you can.
Yes, that's the thing. Don't wait until last minute.
Yeah. Bear, I want to go back to something you said earlier. It's going to kind of like force the conversation there a little bit, just because I did like to love this comment so much. You had said in a different setting, different video that when something goes wrong, it's like one of your best opportunities to have a great developer experience. I'd like just love to hear more about that from you now.
Yeah. So it's all great if people are on the happy path, they go through a quick start and everything turns out exactly as it should. But as I'm sure anyone who has ever tried a tool or an API in this room knows that sometimes it doesn't. You're like, whoa, I'm missing this dependency, and like, what's going on here? And go to Google and Stack Overflow, what's happening? And the way that you can turn that around is whether you've got good support experiences, whether a simple search is able to rectify the situation for people, and when they look and see who is actually providing answers to all of these myriad questions that people might run into in the non-happy path, how much of that is actually coming from your company? How much of it is coming from other people? Is any of it incorrect and still floating around, and has anyone made an effort to correct it? All of that is much more, it contributes to enhancing trust that much more, because it's very easy to sell something with shiny marketing packaging saying this is the best tool in the whole wide world, but we know that there will always be bugs. And so if you can show that you handle failure gracefully and you support your customers through it, and you have even really nice things like Stripe, I think at some point aggregated the errors that you were seeing in your console and then suggested docs for how to fix common errors that mapped to the types of things that you were encountering on your account. Beautiful. Like that really shows people that you have their backs when it's not going to go as smoothly as it says on the box.
I love that. Just a follow up on what you just said, though. I was thinking about as a developer when I'm having a problem with something and I search for a solution. Sometimes, like you said, sometimes the solution's from the community, sometimes it's from there's a solution from the owner of the API, the actual builder. Do you think it matters like where you're getting the answer from? Do you I don't know, because maybe in my head I'm like, oh, okay, there's like a community. This is really great. I'm not alone.
Yeah.
But also the thing was broken, and I needed someone in the community to tell me how to fix it. Like, why didn't it just work? I don't know. How do you think that factors in?
So I think there are two layers there. Some of it depends on your product. And so speaking from Pinecone experience, Pinecone is in a very new space where there aren't that many people who are expert at understanding large language models, embeddings, vector databases. And so sometimes community answers can be wrong. And that's something that if they get very popular or if they're just missing some nuance, it is really important to go back and correct, because the locus of expertise is within your company. But when it comes to things like, do people walk away with a negative impression because there are lots and lots of forum questions about the ways that your product is broken? Maybe. But I think in a lot of ways, the mode in which a question is answered affects my perception, at least, much more of the company than whether or not there are lots of support tickets.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to pivot to failure modes unless anyone has any last comments on success modes. Okay, so let's start with you, John, on failure modes. What are some failure modes? What does bad DX look like? Other than the lack of the things we just talked about.
Well, I mean, support tickets is an easy one, but I think the developers not feeling heard is a pretty big one. If your developers are spending the time to use your product and they're very passionate about it enough to like write in and participate in the community or write support tickets or keep nudging you, you should listen to them. And they know when you're not listening to them, and they talk to each other. So I think that's a big one, is just not listening to your community. Sometimes there's product choices that you make because you are opinionated or you feel like this is the best way to do it. And I think another failure mode is maybe being bullheaded on a decision when your community is telling you something otherwise. So I just feel like making sure your community, your developers have a voice into the product that they're adopting is a big part of it. And you don't want to fail your developers.
What do you folks think about failure modes?
Oh, all right. Well, I'm a bit biased, and I think us DevRel practitioners have some key role to play here, being the layer between the product teams and the community, so we can relay feedback and help explain the decisions that were made by the product teams. I think this plays an important role, and in any case, I think yes, developers need to be heard. So if you don't listen to them, that won't work. So yeah, that's my take.
Anything to add?
I mean, other than
There are
a
lots.
strong +1 to you should absolutely listen to your community. Thinking about how, no, I'm coming up short because of this.
I think, yeah. I mean, it was
That's the
no idea.
deepest failure mode is.
Trust is hard to gain, but it's exceptionally easy to lose.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Agree with that.
I'll repeat the one I said earlier, which is like breaking changes and not really knowing how that affects your developers. It's a big one. You know, if they're trying to build something that they have customers for, and if you're breaking their customers and you're not empathetic to that, I think that is a huge failure mode on all layers of it.
Yeah. And part and parcel of that and not listening to your customers is being disconnected from them as well. I've seen a clear difference in companies where there's been a strong support culture where engineers had to talk to customers on a regular basis, and the ones where support and things like sales engineering are designed to be an insulating layer for the engineers to protect them from customer contact. And the difference that you see in terms of interest in providing a good developer experience and whether people are responsive to their community can be reflected really easily, or is reflected strongly in whether people have the mandate to interact with the community a lot.
What you're all talking about, actually, I didn't notice this happened. My daughter somewhat recently said she was interested in investing. So I was like, I need to find, some kind of brokerage firm where I can open up an investment account for a child. I was like sort of thinking about how she would be able to sort of consume the information of like what was happening with her account, like the investments that she was making. So I was like, okay, they're going to need APIs. And then I actually, I'm not going to name any brokerage firms, but there's some obvious ones that like you might have gravitated to that they actually had APIs, but they didn't work. And then they had community support who was willing to say in community forums, like, yes, we're aware this isn't working. So it's like the people were there, like sort of owning the message, but the solutions weren't there. And I was like, okay, like I'm like literally not gonna, like, we're talking it's a small amount of money. I'm sure they don't really care, but like, I literally lost a customer over a lack of that community engagement. And it was just clear to me that, it was not a priority to them. So I think it makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so we have 7 minutes left. Let's go to crystal ball mode. What's your biggest predictions for developer experience, especially as it relates to APIs over the next few years? Let's start all the way at the end. Yeah.
So I work at Replit. Replit's AI first. I mean, a lot of companies are AI first. We've been using AI for a while, but we help developers write code through AI. And my prediction is AI is going to be a bigger consumer of APIs than developers are right now. I think AI plus RAG is just going to start almost overwhelming APIs to the point, maybe in a positive way because you can start charging for it. But I think the bigger thing I question is like, is REST, is gRPC, that type of thing, the right protocol for LLMs, or will there be a new protocol that models use to consume that data, the way you charge for it? There might be a new paradigm. I mean, there'll always be APIs and systems that connect, but I bet when it's not a human at the other end of it, maybe there's a way to move faster and have more bandwidth in it. So that's one prediction I have.
I'm a little terrified about what you just said because I'm thinking about like a bunch of LLMs being like, hey, this would be a better protocol. Like this is how information should be disseminated and called for. Okay, same question for you, Bear.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very similar answer in mind to Sean's because I also work at an AI company. Imagine that. And
Yeah.
I think what we mean when we think of intuitive APIs and what qualifies as well-designed will change, because if there is a machine consuming it at the end of the day rather than a human, consistency is going to matter much more. Making sure you really invest in publishing good schemas for your API and really sticking to them, all of that is going to shape much more of how people can consume them than anything else, because garbage in, garbage out. And so the investments that you'll see in I think, API design quality will be as much about consistency in making them available to machines to work off of as they will about humans. And that is going to be, I think, a little shift in design thinking, especially because most APIs are built iteratively over time, and you have to make changes where you're like, oh, this doesn't work exactly like V1 did, and we're going to adjust this design. And that's going to matter potentially less, potentially more. I think that the jury's still out on how exactly that will cascade out to various other tools that are consuming your API and then providing services to developers on top of that. But that is going to be something that will probably turn our perception of DX design on its ear.
Playing out that movie just a tiny bit, like it's almost like not developer experience at that point. It's like
machine
machine
experience.
experience.
Yeah.
With so obviously developer experience won't go away. Presumably, hopefully, there's still humans somewhere.
Yeah,
somewhere in the process. But at some point, yeah, you also need to think about the machine experience.
Yeah, with some veneer, like you need to make sure that it's still editable by humans. So you can't go full gobbledygook. There has to be something that humans can still read and interact with.
You just push the human further up the stack, maybe.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly what you were going to say. So, of course, I'm
But it's probably going to happen.
But yes, AI and schemas. And I think both the consumption of API schemas, but also the generation of API schemas are definitely going to be enhanced by AI. So you'll be able to design a schema based on your current APIs, and then another consumer of your APIs will be able to pull your schema out and then ingest it and build a client without any developer really coding. And I think that's going to be like a whole different ways to develop and integrate with APIs.
So that's interesting because maybe just kind of riffing on what you're saying with the schemas. A lot of folks I talk to, we were talking about tech writers before, a little bit with, not always getting the thanks that they need, and some degrees maybe like a thankless job. And the work they do is like super important. Sometimes I talk to tech writers where everything's automated, and they're working off of an open API schema or some other equivalent schema, and so a lot of it, like you were saying before, like up the stacks, like where a human gets involved is just a very different entry point than when they have to manually sync the developer portal to the latest version of a schema. Maybe there is no build artifact, and then like the tech writer has to actually like figure it out. So I think one of the implications of what you're all saying is that if you want to have an API that's usable by an AI, then you're going to have schemas for it to really be able to understand it as well as you want it to. That's maybe starting to like get into what machine experience is.
Yeah. I'll throw another one at you.
Yeah, please.
I think usage-based billing is going to be big. It's creeping up now. I see it everywhere. Compute's expensive. I think we're all putting AI behind our APIs these days in some way, shape, or form. I can imagine APIs become a lot more monetizable through usage-based billing. And I would imagine that's going to start looking more normal to start paying for APIs or some suite of APIs rather than a product that comes with APIs.
And then the onus is also going to be on companies to help people understand how they can even project their compute usage, because that is not necessarily a linear thing to try and track. And so that is a big educational component that will be a challenge.
Yeah.
Or maybe progressively less of a challenge as it becomes more normal and people are like, oh yeah, I can kind of boil this down to how much compute resource you use.
You just close your eyes and say, oh.
Okay, we have about a minute and a half left. I did have more questions, but I think we're at time. So I think that's a wrap for us, folks. We had a goal to learn about how developer experience is changing, how it's prioritized by companies, and learn where it was going. I wasn't really expecting to get into like machine experience, but I learned a lot. I hope you all feel the same way. I just want to give a big thanks to our panelists for flying out here, taking the time, and just like being generous with your experiences and knowledge. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yep, thanks for being here.